Always true.
Wars are often reduced to strategy, front lines, targets, deterrence. But for civilians trying to survive the bombs, war is something else entirely. It's the sound of families forced from their homes in the dark, the sight of cities emptying under relentless bombardment, and the reality of aid workers scrambling to reach people before the systems that sustain life begin to collapse. With the escalating war between the US, Israel and Iran, and violence spreading across the Middle East, aid agencies are raising the alarm. Jan Egeland is the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, one of the largest Western humanitarian organizations still operating in Iran. What his teams are witnessing there points to a crisis expanding far beyond the battlefield. And Egeland says US and Israel are violating international law by failing to observe proportionality and distinction between civilians and military targets. At a moment when the region is once again consumed by conflict, the question is not who wins the war, but how people survive it. Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, talks to Al Jazeera. So Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera. First of all,
thank you.
We're witnessing this war raging in the region, a war started by the US and Israel. What has it done to population stability across the Middle East?
It's been devastating, and it's not enough known to the world that millions are fleeing from the intense bombardment in Iran, in Lebanon, but also elsewhere. It's a regional war. It's often portrayed as some kind of a geopolitical, military, strategic chess game. But it shouldn't be. It's realities for families who are desperate, traumatized, and who are fleeing for their lives.
You mentioned that millions are fleeing. You're one of the few organizations, the few international humanitarian organizations that operate in Iran. So you might see things that not everyone else sees. How many people have been internally displaced, first of all, inside Iran by the US and Israeli attacks?
Well, no one has the exact figure. I've heard 3 million. It could be more. Iran is a huge place, 90 million plus inhabitants. Tehran, which is under intense bombardment day and night, has 10 million inhabitants. It's a huge place. Millions seems to have now left Tehran, but also many other cities. We have 110 aid workers on the ground, where we are, as you say, one of a handful groups. We're the biggest Western aid group in Iran. Our 110 aid workers also flee, many of them with their families, but we have 8 relief centers in as many provinces, and we see how the needs are growing.
I don't mean to belittle your efforts, of course, but 110 aid workers, and you just mentioned that we could be talking about over 3 million people displaced. Is that a number that 110 aid workers can help with? Is there a feeling that you're overwhelmed?
Of course, we're overwhelmed, we're overstretched, and we're underfunded. The main aid work is done by the national organization, by the local organizations.
But shipping has been disrupted, flights have been disrupted. Are local organizations or international organizations like yours even able to bring supplies in that are desperately needed?
At the time, we're not. But of course, we have stocks in the country. We can purchase within Iran. But
how long will those stocks last, though? Sorry to interrupt, but how long are those stocks going to last?
Well, it could be weeks, but we would have to go also to the local markets, the regional markets. Iran is a middle-income country. It has supplies. It's not Somalia. However, the longer this goes, the more disruption there will be to everything also internally. You cannot have thousands of air raids on heavily populated urban areas without a cascading effects where public services fail, where supply lines fail, where shopkeepers are killed, where shops close, where the markets fail, and thereby our aid work is becoming infinitely more difficult.
So what happens after a few weeks when those stocks finish?
That the suffering explodes, really. At the moment, people are fleeing, many in their own cars, out of the main cities, first and foremost Tehran, but also many other places. They go to smaller places because they believe it will be safe there. They are then shocked to see that the smaller places are also bombed. And it's not just military and the nuclear targets this time. It's everything that has to do with the governmental services, with the regime, if you like.
We're talking about millions, 3 million plus people having been displaced in Iran. When you add to that some of the numbers from sources, credible sources about displacement in the region, like the Global Report on Internal Displacement, talks about 11 million in Sudan, over 7 million in Syria, almost 5 million in Yemen, over 3 million in Palestine, 1 million in Iraq, 1 million in Lebanon, or around 1 million in Lebanon. What is the bigger picture? Are we heading towards a region of displaced populations?
We do, and it's and the entire Middle East affected, but is also beyond. You didn't mention Afghanistan. Afghanistan is next door to Iran. Afghanistan, governed now by the Taliban, is in its own war with Pakistan. The border crossings where we work between Iran and Afghanistan have been bombed. It's hard for people now to flee from Afghanistan to Iran and from Iran to Afghanistan, and there are people going in both directions. It's traumatizing for entire nations and populations.
And coming back to Iran, though, international human rights organizations cite reports of Israeli and US attacks on medical centers, some 10 medical centers, a school which killed, as you know, 165 schoolgirls and staff members, according to local Iranian reports. Amnesty International talks about how US and Israeli strikes are putting prisoners, including children, at risk. There have been reports of strikes on sports centers, 18 boys and girls being killed while playing volleyball. Are you concerned that the US and Israel are violating international humanitarian law?
Yeah, because it is not proportional. I mean, there are three rules for warfare. Your warfare has to be proportional, not excessive. This seems to be disproportional. There has to be distinction between civilian and military targets. But when you have so many thousands of air raids, of course, there will be cascading effects for the civilians, and you have to show precaution. That's the third principle. And there's not enough precaution when a girls' school is bombed because it belonged to an area that once was owned by the Revolutionary Guards. So all of this to say, we need a ceasefire. We cannot continue like this. And it's not just in Iran, it's also in Lebanon. But as you will know, there is also indiscriminate missiles going the other way from Iran, from Hezbollah, into the Gulf countries, into Israel, that is completely indiscriminate. It could go anywhere, really. It has to end. We need a ceasefire.
Yeah. Of course, we've heard the US president deny that the US was responsible for the attack on the girls' school, although US media investigative reports have pointed or indicated otherwise. You mentioned the Iranian attacks on Gulf countries, which have hit civilian infrastructure, airports, civilian installations. Are you worried about the effects of these attacks on the stability of civilian life and the violation of international humanitarian law there too?
Absolutely. I mean, that is completely indiscriminate. I mean, on the other way, it's disproportionate. There is not enough precaution. It's too excessive. It seems that what goes the other way is completely indiscriminate, and it could on both sides massively hit water supply, electricity, and have this breakdown of services in urban areas.
What would that mean? Could that lead to massive population upheaval in the Gulf?
Well, it would mean that people would not have safe drinking water. It would not have. It would mean that people would be suffering. It would mean that the healthcare would suffer. It could be epidemic disease. I mean, that's of course the worst scenarios. We're close to that, I think, now in Iran and in Lebanon, because of the ferocity of the bombardment. But the missiles going the other way could hit things that are illegal under international law. You cannot and should not and must not hit civilian infrastructure that is needed for the survival of the civilian population.
And as you mentioned, we've seen Iranian missiles and drones also take civilian casualties, cause civilian deaths and injuries in Israel. When you look at the bigger picture of this, people are wondering, is the international order, is international law dead at this point?
No, it's not dead. I'm old enough to remember the War of the Balkans, where the same argument was. It was made. It's the end of humanitarian law as we know of it, of international law. Now it's the law of the jungle. But of course, we're now in a deep crisis for geopolitical cooperation, for conflict resolution, for conflict prevention. It seems that men with power and guns believe they can solve problems the military way. And it's nearly
But is it different, Jan, with all due respect, is it different this time than the Balkans when you have the leader of a nuclear-armed superpower threatening on Truth Social, quote, military consequences to Iran at a level never seen before, and threatening to, quote, make it virtually impossible for Iran to ever be built back as a nation. Death, fire, fury. I mean, doesn't that make you worry that we're at a new level?
We haven't seen that level of language before. No, true. I mean, of course, the bombing of Iraq during Saddam Hussein was also called something with fury and shock and awe and so on. That was the whole point of it. Overwhelming military force is one thing that one has been discussing again and again. My point is, what did they achieve in Iraq after having spent hundreds of billions of dollars, or in Afghanistan after having spent hundreds of billions of dollars, and the Taliban is back? And I think that's a key point here also. How come it's easier to spend a couple of $1 billion per day in this current conflict? Because that's what they're spending, the West and Iran and the Gulf countries. But we cannot give them millions to save lives among civilians, women and children. We're completely underfunded in our life-saving work in these countries.
Can any humanitarian, any coalition, even alliance of humanitarian organizations, deal with a scenario in which nations are bombed until they can never be built back? Is that something within, I mean, do you plan for stuff like that when you read these kinds of comments?
Well, we do as much. We're humanitarians. I have meetings day and night now with my colleagues within the region on how can we search, how can we bring in new teams, how are we able to do supplies from outside? Can we use cash transfers? Iran is under sanctions. The Western sanctions against Iran makes it more difficult for us to help the victims of this conflict, those who could even be sympathizing with the aims of the West. It's a lot of cascading effects here, but we're waking up every morning to try to do our utmost, and we try to tell the decision makers, we need a ceasefire and we need a surge in saving lives. Maybe we could stop spending billions and billions on something which has never really worked, which is to bomb regime change, to bomb solutions to intricate problems. The language on all sides here is very disruptive. Who's talking about rebuilding, protecting humanity, make humanity great again? That would be my message.
Focusing then on the humanitarian effort on the ground, and you mentioned Lebanon. Our correspondent has been reporting on how even after people have moved from areas like the southern suburbs of Beirut after the issuance of Israeli forced evacuation orders, and they go to other civilian areas, we've seen attacks follow them. Are you worried that this pattern of Israeli attacks is preventing displaced people from finding refuge anywhere?
Yeah, I've seen that myself in Lebanon, that, Shia women, children, grandmothers fleeing from southern Lebanon to elsewhere are met with a lot of suspicion by the local population there, because they know Israel is really bombing anything that could be associated with Hezbollah, which makes it impossible for these people to really find refuge.
What happens to them? And can you help them? What is it that you can do? So this is something you've seen yourself.
In Lebanon, we have a bigger machine than we have in Iran. Several hundred aid workers were supporting dozens and dozens of collective centers, and also receiving Lebanese who flee into Syria, because it's a sign that it's really bad in Lebanon that people flee into war-ravaged and not rebuilt Syria. But that's where many end up. We are, however, again, overstretched, underfunded. There is too little attention to saving lives and too much attention on military escalation that will make everything worse.
You know, I was reading about an incident and I thought about how it impacts the work of organizations like yours. On March the 6th, reports talk about on March the 6th, Israeli forces disguising themselves in ambulances while they launched a raid into Nebichit in Lebanon. Does that undermine the sense of safety that humanitarian workers from organizations like yours feel when you go in with clearly marked vehicles?
And it's a war crime to be misusing ambulances. There's been claims on both sides that the other side are camouflaging themselves as aid workers or health workers or ambulance workers with the Red Cross symbol, which is a protective emblem for aid. That it's a war crime. What part of our problem is, of course, that there is impunity now for too many of the crimes committed by all sides. And what happens is that you end up in some kind of a mud wrestling game where it's seen as you can do whatever it takes to win because the other side is so terrible. Well, if you become like them, who's the good and who's the bad guy in these fights. I see only bad guys now fighting each other in too many of these scenarios.
Are you concerned, Mr. Egeland, that we're seeing a pattern of Israeli attacks that attempt to create a buffer zone through permanent forced displacement in southern Lebanon?
Well, in southern Lebanon, we've seen incursion after incursion after incursion. I remember being a young UN soldier in southern Lebanon in 1978. That was among these Israeli incursions. Again, it hasn't solved any of the issues. And of course, Israel is hit by missiles from Hezbollah's side. What all of this screams at is a diplomatic, negotiated settlement where the international sponsors of the parties help bring about agreements. It's not going to be these military campaigns that saw more hatred, more generations who feel that they have to seek revenge. I think that's part of the problem across the Middle East.
We must talk about Gaza as well. We're 5 months into a shaky ceasefire in Gaza. Much of the population, though, still displaced. Why? What is stopping perhaps organizations like yours from trying to help people back into a more settled lifestyle in their communities again?
I think Gaza, where I've been many times over the years, is an example of a job only half done, not even half done. Yes, the big war is over, but there is no solution to the underlying problems there, and new problems have come. My organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and 40 other fine international groups, American, European, and others, are being banned by Israel from doing work in and from Israel, which makes it impossible for us to enter Gaza and to have people going in and out and supplies going in and out.
I wonder what you think, where you think this is going. In a report of February the 19th, the UN raised concerns over, quote, ethnic cleansing in Gaza and the West Bank because of what it said was, I apologize for that noise, that is actually a warning that we get here when there is incoming missiles or drones suspected. And just to clarify for our viewers, of course, this is happening as we record this show, Wednesday, March the 11th. We'll try and continue, though, with our interview. So as I was saying, the UN, in a report of February the 19th, raised concern about ethnic cleansing in Gaza and the West Bank. Are you worried? Are you seeing a pattern of ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily call it that, but what I see...
What do you call it then?
Well, I see de facto annexation by the occupying power Israel of increasing parts of the occupied West Bank. And of course, they are now keeping under military control part of the little Gaza crammed place for Palestine is under Israeli military rule, and they're still completely destroying every infrastructure possibility for the Palestinians there. So it's just horrific what's happening, and the Gulf countries that can speak to Israel and have the ear of Netanyahu, and the US and Germany and others need to do more to say if it's wrong for Russia to occupy Ukraine, that we all agree on, how come it's tolerated that Israel use occupation as some way of stealing land for their settlers, the thugs that are organized and beat up Palestinian women and children every day? The hypocrisy is astounding.
Where did the population go? Whether we call it de facto annexation or ethnic cleansing, we've had one US plan at one point talk about the removal of Palestinians from Gaza. Where does the population ultimately go, especially in places as well, we mustn't forget, like the West Bank, which international human rights organizations have cited Israeli attacks, settler attacks, as depopulating Palestinian centers and neighborhoods?
People are crammed together in smaller and smaller and more crowded ghettos, towns, urban areas, and the land is taken over by settlers or military Israeli organizations. The Bedouins, who have been 50 years outside of Jericho, are now forced to leave their livestock, which is often stolen. I've seen it with my own eyes, by criminal settler gangs. And they end up as miserable recipients of our aid in some town somewhere. And they have to live their life that they've had for hundreds of generations as Bedouins across these areas.
Got to ask you a final question about maybe the largest displacement situation in the region, which of course is Sudan. Okay, I just got to mention, if you're hearing those sounds of explosions, we assume that is attempts to intercept anything incoming. So apologies for the noise there. But yeah, the situation in Sudan. Over 11 million people displaced. Is anyone able to deal with that? Is there hope for that situation?
I was recently in South Kordofan in Sudan. It's now the worst conflict area and possibly the worst famine situation in what is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, Sudan. We're scaling up. We have only a few weeks before the rainy season when roads become impossible. I mean, we cannot go there. So we're working with 40 local groups to scale up.
Can you scale up in time before the famine spreads?
Where we will go from 100,000 to 500,000 people that we will try to help.
Jan, how many lives are at stake? Just to put it in perspective for people, how many lives are at stake right now in Sudan?
Oh, in Sudan, it's 20 million people who urgently need assistance, and we're perhaps reaching half of them. So I must say, we as humanitarian workers feel increasingly alone with the civilian population in the midst of these crossfires, because we're really so overwhelmed and we feel there is not enough resources, nor attention, nor support for our work.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you. My pleasure.